You can also manually create a blank pivot table that you can then customize as desired. To do this, click the Insert tab in the ribbon and then click the Pivot Table button in the Tables button group. You will then see the Create Pivot Table dialog box appear. Within this dialog box, you must first select the source of data for the pivot table within the Choose the Data that you want to analyze section. If you select the Select a Table or Range option button, then click the Collapse Expand dialog box button at the right end of the Table Range field to collapse the dialog box down to a single line. Then just click and drag over the cell range or table that you want to use as the data source for your pivot table. Then click the same Collapse Expand dialog box button again to expand the dialog box when you have finished selecting the data cells within your workbook. Alternately, to use a named table as your data source, type the name of the table into the Table Range field instead of manually selecting the cell range reference. You could also type an absolute cell range reference into the Table Range field if desired, instead of manually selecting the cell range. If you select the Use an External Data Source option button, click the Choose Connection button to open the Existing Connections dialog box. Within the Existing Connections dialog box, you'll see any connections available. You can use the Show drop-down at the top of the dialog box to select the All Connections choice if needed. That will display all data connections within your workbook, computer, and network within 3 separate sections. Select the data connection you would like to use for your pivot table from the connections shown within this dialog box. Then click the Open button to return to the Create Pivot Table dialog box. To use Excel tables from your workbook's data model as your pivot table's data source, click the Tables tab at the top of the Existing Connections dialog box. Then select either an individual table or select the Tables and Workbook Data Model choice to select all the tables within the data model. Then click the Open button to return to the Create Pivot Table dialog box. Next, choose the location where you want to place the pivot table from the options shown within the Choose Where You Want the Pivot Table Report to be Placed section. You can select the New Worksheet option button to place the pivot table into a new worksheet. You can select the Existing Worksheet option button to select a location within an existing worksheet. If you select this option, then you can either enter an absolute cell address location into the location text box or use the Collapse Expand dialog box button at the right end of the field to collapse the dialog box down to a single line so that you can click on the cell that you want to select within an existing worksheet. You can then click the same button again to expand the dialog box when you're finished. Note that the cell that you enter or select will become the upper left corner of the pivot table. Next, to add your selected data to an internal data model used by your Excel workbook, you can check the Add this data to the data model checkbox. This will add the selected data to the data model in your Excel workbook. In Excel, you can store and relate data from multiple tables in the data model, which you can then manipulate and analyze using pivot tables. When finished, click the OK button to create your new pivot table. You will then see the Pivot Table Fields task pane appear at the side of your workbook window. In the Pivot Table Fields pane, you will see the fields from your data source. You can change the values displayed within the pivot table by using the Pivot Table Fields task pane. You can check the checkbox next to any field within the Choose Fields to Add to Report section to add that to one of the quadrants shown in the Drag Fields Between Areas Below section at the bottom of the task pane. If you check a field, Excel will simply add that into one of the 4 quadrants shown. For pivot tables, these quadrants are filters, columns, rows, and values. You can also click and drag the fields shown from one quadrant to another based on what function or layout you want the pivot table to show. Note that fields that are placed into the Values section are calculated using the Sum function by default.